The old woman trusts Marcus completely. She'll sign whatever he brings her. That's what the email said about me. I read it twice. Then I closed the laptop very quietly. My name is Vivian Marsh. I am 67 years old, and I want to tell you about the morning I found an email that wasn't meant for my eyes sitting at my son's kitchen table with a cup of coffee going cold in my hands, while outside the window the Atlantic moved the way it always does, indifferently, steadily, without any particular concern for what was happening inside that house. I sat there a moment looking at the grain of the wood table thinking, well, there it is. But I'm getting ahead of myself. Let me back up. Gerald built the studio the summer after Marcus was born. It started as a garage conversion and became something else entirely over 20 years. Good acoustics, a Yamaha upright along the north wall, and eventually the 1962 Steinway Grand. We found it an estate sale in Providence and spent 3 months restoring together. Gerald used to say the piano had been waiting for us. I used to tell him he was being sentimental. I was wrong about that. When Gerald died 8 years ago, I kept teaching. I kept the studio open 6 days a week. I kept the Steinway tuned every 6 months, whether it needed it or not. Some things you maintain because they matter, and some things you maintain because stopping would mean admitting something you're not ready to admit yet. With me and that piano, it was honestly probably both. Marcus is my only child. He's 41, works in finance, and has his father's eyes and his father's laugh, and I had always believed his father's fundamental decency. When he called me 3 years ago about a woman he'd met at a work function, his voice had that particular brightness I hadn't heard since he was maybe 19. Mom, I think she might be it. I wanted to love Renata. I genuinely made the effort. She was sharp and composed in the way of someone who has spent years being the smartest person in the room and has arranged her entire personality around that fact. She was a corporate attorney. She remembered details, arrived prepared, never said anything she couldn't defend. Marcus lit up around her, and for a long time I told myself that was enough. But something behind her warmth never quite held. She asked questions that felt like research. She listened to my answers the way a person listens when they're filing information rather than actually hearing it. I told myself I was being a difficult mother-in-law before I'd even been given the chance. I nearly convinced myself completely. Have you ever had a feeling that lived quietly in your chest for months before it had any evidence to stand on? The email was open on Marcus's laptop on a Tuesday morning in October. I was staying with them for a long weekend. He had gone out early for a run. Renata had a conference call. I came downstairs, found the kitchen empty, and made coffee. The laptop was open on the counter. I wouldn't have read it, except that my own name was there in the subject line, and when you see your own name, you look the way you look when someone says it across a crowded room. The email was from Renata to a name I didn't recognize. Subject line, Marsh Property Timeline. The body was 2 paragraphs. The first described the studio and the coastal house square footage, estimated market value, proximity to the water potential for boutique hotel conversion. The second paragraph read, "The old woman trusts Marcus completely. Once we establish the joint account structure, she'll sign whatever he brings her. We need to move before she updates her estate documents." The old woman. I read it twice. I closed the laptop. I stood at the window looking at the water, and I thought about Gerald, about the last real conversation we had, the one where he held my hand and said, "Vivian, don't let anyone make you small. You've worked too hard for that." I drove home that afternoon, both hands on the wheel, radio off. The coast road in October is beautiful in a way that doesn't care about anything you're going through, the light coming off the water sideways and gold the trees along the ridge already turning. I drove through all of it in that specific silence that happens when you're carrying something too important to put down, but too heavy to process all at once. By the time I pulled into my own driveway, I'd made 3 decisions, not 10, 3. And I made them before I went inside because I knew once I walked into the studio and sat at Gerald's old table and the familiar quiet settled around me, I might start softening. I didn't want to soften, not yet. First, I would not tell Marcus. Not immediately. He loved her, and love doesn't simply fold when someone hands it secondhand evidence from a kitchen counter. He would have questioned what I thought I'd read. And whatever small window I had to protect anything would have closed. Second, I would call Diane. Third, I would go to the wedding. Diane Wu and I had been in the same dormitory freshman year of college, lost touch for nearly 2 decades, and found each other again at a seminar 12 years ago. She had become an estate attorney. Some friendships find their shape eventually. She heard everything without interrupting. When I finished, she was quiet for a moment, then said, "Vivian, I need to tell you something. I've seen this before, not in the abstract. Specifically, I have seen Renata's name before. She had handled a case 4 years earlier. A different family, a different property, the same methodology. Confidentiality bound her from specifics, but she could tell me this much: she knew exactly what we were dealing with, and she knew how to build something it couldn't touch." Over the following 6 weeks, while I attended engagement dinners and smiled across restaurant tables and let Renata refill my wine glass Diane was building, my savings moved into a protected account. The deed to the coastal house went into a revocable living trust in my name alone, with the designated beneficiary being a music education foundation Gerald had quietly supported for years. Not Marcus, not Renata. The house would go somewhere Gerald believed in, and that felt more right than I had expected it to. The studio became an LLC, with its own operating structure completely independent of my personal estate. The 1962 Steinway, the piano, Gerald and I had driven to Providence to retrieve that we had spent 3 months restoring together, that had lived in that studio for 19 years. I had it appraised, documented, and written into the trust by name. When Marcus brought up very warmly, very casually over Christmas dinner, the idea of simplifying my account so he could help manage things as I got older, I smiled and told him Diane was still reviewing everything, and I'd be in touch as soon as she finished. He smiled back. He glanced at Renata. She was cutting her food with great precision and didn't look up. We all understood that moment exactly. Would you have said anything, or would you have smiled and let it pass? The wedding gift was my idea. Renata had admired the Steinway the previous spring, in the particular way people admire things when they are quietly calculating what they are worth. She had mentioned twice that the studio must feel too large for just me these days. I heard what she was actually saying. So when Marcus asked if I might like to contribute something to the wedding, I offered the Steinway. I told them it deserved to be played more than I could manage alone, that Gerald would have wanted it to stay in the family. I watched Renata's face as I said it. Something moved through her expression, satisfaction wearing the costume of gratitude. The ceremony itself was genuinely beautiful, and I want that to come through clearly because it matters. Marcus stood at the end of that aisle with his father's posture and his father's nervous hands, and something opened up in my chest watching him that I don't have a clean word for. The tears were real. Whatever came afterward, that part was entirely real. The Steinway was delivered to their apartment 12 days before the wedding. It was sold to a dealer in Boston within 10 days of them returning from the honeymoon. Marcus called to tell me. He said Renata had decided the apartment wasn't the right space for it. His voice had a quality I recognized as the one he gets when he is repeating something he's been told to say. I told him I understood, and I did understand. I understood everything. What would you have felt receiving that phone call? 3 months later, Renata announced she was pregnant. She told me at a Sunday lunch across the same table where Marcus had first raised the subject of my accounts, with the careful timing she brought to everything. I watched her face as she said it, and understood this was meant to change my calculation. This was meant to make me feel I could not afford to be anything other than generous and yielding. I told them I was happy for them. I drove home and called Diane, who reminded me gently but directly that nothing in the legal documents changed because of a grandchild. The trust was built correctly. Stay steady. I stayed steady. The pregnancy ended 2 months later. Renata told me by text message, whatever the circumstances, I sent flowers and didn't push. That loss was real, and I was not going to treat it as anything other than what it was. But I noticed something shift after that. Marcus started calling more. Not about accounts, just to talk the way he used to call in college when something was sitting wrong with him and he needed to hear a familiar voice work through it. He mentioned once carefully that he had found something in Renata's files he didn't understand. He moved on quickly. I listened and said nothing and waited. Have you ever watched something come undone slowly and understood the only useful thing you could do was be present when it finished? 4 months later, Marcus called on a Saturday morning while I was unlocking the studio. The early light was coming in off the water, the way it does in March, low and long and honest. Mom, he said, I need to show you something. He had found a folder on Renata's laptop. Property valuations, development correspondence, a thread of emails with the same name I had seen in that October message, laying out in considerable detail a multi-step plan for consolidating my assets. The folder also contained legal documentation from 4 years earlier, a different property, a different family annotated in Renata's own handwriting. He drove up that afternoon. We sat at Gerald's old table in the studio and I told him everything. The October email, Diane, the trust, the LLC, the 3 decisions made in my driveway before I'd gone inside. The Steinway. He was quiet for a long time. Not defensive quiet, undone quiet. There's a difference, and I know my son well enough to know which one it was. He said, you knew all of this and you still came to the wedding. I told him the wedding wasn't his fault. I told him I was his mother, and there was no version of this where I wasn't there to watch him get married. He put his head in his hands. I let him sit with it. Do you think you could hold steady across a table from your own child in a moment like that? The marriage lasted 9 more months. Watching it come apart was painful because it always is, regardless of the reasons. But Marcus made his decisions when he was ready, when he had seen enough with his own eyes to trust what he was seeing. He walked out without losing a single thing that belonged to him. Renata's attorney sent 2 letters regarding my assets. Diane responded to both. There was nothing to contest, and everyone involved knew it eventually. Marcus spent a month with me that winter. We refinished the studio floors together and restrung the Yamaha that had been sitting untuned in the corner since summer. He learned how to sit with silence in a room where music had lived for a long time. That's a harder skill than it sounds, and he worked at it honestly. One evening, he looked up and asked how I had stayed calm through all of it. I thought about Gerald, about sitting across from Diane and deciding that protecting what was real mattered more than avoiding what was difficult. I told him, when you have already survived the worst loss of your life, the other storms don't reach the same place in you. You've already learned that you can stay standing. That changes something permanently. He nodded and went back to work. In the spring, I opened the studio on Saturday mornings to children from a low-income program 2 towns over. The room fills up now in a way it hasn't in years. Small hands finding wrong notes, then finding right ones, laughter moving through the space where Gerald's music used to live. Some mornings, I stand in the doorway and listen and feel something I can only describe as the specific kind of fullness that comes when a room is finally being used for exactly what it was built for. The Steinway is gone, and I have made my peace with that. What Gerald and I built together was never a piano. It was this, the room, the decades of work, the life that made the room possible. Those things are still here. The trust still stands. The LLC carries its 2nd year. The house faces the same water it always has. I was not too old to be taken advantage of the way Renata had assumed I was. I was old enough to recognize what was coming before it could arrive. That is a different thing entirely, and it took me 67 years to know the difference. Marcus calls on Sunday evenings now. He called last week while I was locking up after the last lesson of the day, and we talked for nearly an hour about nothing that mattered very much, and it was the best conversation I'd had in weeks. If you were in my position, would you have done what I did and protected everything quietly? Or would you have confronted it the moment you saw that email? Leave your answer in the comments. I read every single one, and I mean that. And if this story stayed with you, share it with someone you love. Because sometimes the greatest thing we can offer the people who matter to us isn't a warning. It's a foundation solid enough that when the hard things come, and they always come, there is still somewhere safe for them to land.